in their discussion of Protestantism on the preceding page. They just cover the 15th century after Christ. This period witnessed two religious movements: the disruption of the unity of Christianity in the Occident and the synthesis of a new religion in the Orient. In Europe, institutionalized Christianity had attained that degree of inelasticity which rendered further growth incompatible with unity. In the Orient, the combined teachings of Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism were synthesized by Nanak and his followers into Sikhism, one of the most advanced religions of Asia. It isn't very big, though. The Sikhs are not a large community, but they're compact and they fight hard. Well, back to Judaism. Judaism carries the heaviest strain of Melchizedek's teachings, and Judaism is not an original religion. Judaism started out with Egyptian culture. Moses himself was half Egyptian. If you would like to trace out the Egyptian background of the Old Testament, there's only one book I know that has it, and that is The Dawn of Conscience by Breasted. The Dawn of Conscience is an examination of the evolution of moral concepts along the Nile. It's an awfully good book to read in connection with a section in these papers which discuss the Melchizedek teachings along the Nile. It's the only book I've found in which you can read much about Amenemop mentioned in the Blue Book. And Breasted points out where Amenemop's teachings from his Book of Wisdom have been repeated in the Old Testament, and how it explains some of the peculiar idiom of the Old Testament which doesn't make good sense in a pastoral country, but makes excellent sense in the Nile Valley. Jewish religion is a synthesis of Melchizedek's teachings as reflected in some of the teachings of Akhenaten, the teachings of Amenemop, perhaps the teachings of Akban, whom we don't know anything about. He's mentioned in the Blue Book as a prophet in Egypt. They speak of 4 prophets as having risen along the Nile. Akban, they murdered. Amenemop, they ignored. Akhenaten, they disavowed. And Moses, they drove out. Moses was the 4th prophet along the Nile. I think the Jewish religion is the only religion which had a fortuitous succession of teachers. I think the Old Testament is fascinating because you can see the God concept evolving if you look for it and are not beguiled by the fact that the same name is used. These papers speak of 2 religions which have evolved enormously: Judaism and Mahayana Buddhism. Starting from something, they became something quite different. The Yahweh concept starts out as the spirit demon of the fulminating volcano of Sinai. This is the kind of a demon who could give, you might say, underhanded advice to his chosen people. He is for his people and he doesn't care about any other people. When they're getting ready to flee Egypt, he advises them to glom on to all the Egyptian possessions which they can get their hands on. This concept of a God for us and not the aliens apparently is a necessary part of the evolution of religion. Example, when Akhenaten, a century or so prior to Moses, when he taught that Aton was an international god, it took the heart out of the Egyptian army fighting in Syria. If Aton is as much for these Hittites as he is for us, we're whipped. It subtracted from men's courage. Akhenaten's teaching of monotheism helped collapse the Asiatic possessions of Egypt. The Jews had an additional reason to believe in a future, because their God was not alone, but he was greatest among the gods, and he was for them. Moses started with henotheism, which is the exaltation of one God among the many, and apparently is a necessary step in the evolution of monotheism out of polytheism. The Jewish religion was greatly influenced by the Babylonian captivity. In the Babylonian captivity, they received a full exposure to Zoroastrianism. They also received a terrible shock to their nationalism. And it was in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley that the great ideological struggle was fought between the two forces of Judaism, and the bad guys won. It was a struggle between nationalism and internationalism. The priesthood were espousing the nationalist cause. Second Isaiah's writings portray the internationalist concept of Yahweh. This is the apex of the evolution of the God concept among the Hebrews. And if you'll read part 4 of the Urantia book carefully, you will discover that Jesus has virtually quoted everything that 2nd Isaiah said, which means he endorses it. This is a big God concept. This nationalist victory was accomplished by the rewriting of the Old Testament. They took the book of the doings of the kings of Judah and the book of the doings of the kings of Israel and a few other sources, and they rewrote this Old Testament as we now have it. They miraculized the Old Testament. This helped get the people back to Judea. It helped rebuild Jerusalem. It was a powerful nationalistic stimulus. And it was so powerful that when they later on lost their sovereignty and regained it and lost it again, it made it impossible for them to accept Jesus, because he was not the Messiah. He was not coming in the nationalist pattern. They were looking for another David, as they had written David up. And as near as I can see, David was a bit of a stinker. That Bathsheba episode is just plain shameful, you know. Nationalism in the Jewish religion finally splintered under Titus. There were too many Romans. It's like the Finns fighting the Russians. I'll bet you these Jews gave the Romans the fight of their life, but the Romans had too many legions. And they dispersed the Jewish people. They completed their dispersion all over the known world. The later history of the Jewish people in Europe is a rather horrible thing to read. And if you've got a good strong stomach, you'll find it in Will Durant's Story of Civilization in the volume The Age of Faith. In Will Durant's Age of Faith, I find the only account that's handy of what happened to the Jews in Europe. And as you read this story, you are going to grow very ashamed of Christians. Did you know that the first Crusaders, when they came along the Rhine, decided it would be a pretty good idea to take care of these heretics, and that thousands of Jews were killed, that synagogues were broken into, and when they broke in, they found that the men had killed all the women and then had killed each other to avoid forcible conversion. There was one real sporting German baron that gave him a castle as a sporting chance, and the Crusaders did not take that castle. They fought them all. It's a shameful story, and it represents the greatest problem that the Blue Book has in dealing with Jewish people today. If you'd like to read something else, you might read Shulam Ash's Introduction to the Nazarene, in which he tells how, as a little boy, in Warsaw, he first met Christ. He was a very small boy, and he left the ghetto to go across town. It was on the Sabbath. He was dressed up in his Sabbath best. And some Polish boys, good Christian boys, much larger than he was, got a hold of him. They roughed him up, they tore his clothes, they blooded his nose until he said, "We crucified Christ." This is how Sholamash met Christ for the first time.
What's the name of the book?
The Nazarene. Today, I find this among Jewish people. My grandparents were Orthodox. My parents were confused. I have no religion. This is pretty much the pattern. I pick it up in our attempted measurement of religious motivation. Many of them score quite low. And I make this prediction: as Judaism loses its hold on the Jewish people will cease to be Jews. This is the cement that's held them together many, many generations. I think the liberal Jew is a good prospect for the Urantia book if he didn't meet Christ as Sholamash met Christ. The word Christ is a pretty dirty word. Oh, you have one religion left. You want to talk about it?
Sure. Which one?
Christianity.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Christianity started out competing pretty hard with not the established religion of the Roman state, but with the mystery religions, which had come into the Roman state, and which the patrician Roman families abhorred. These were Oriental mysteries. Was it said the Orontes, or the river alongside of Antioch, now flows into the Tiber? The Romans never had much of a religion, any more than did the Greeks. The Romans had even less of a religion than the Greeks. Happy-go-lucky Zeus is hardly an object of worship. In the last analysis, Zeus remained a small-sized god. He never became a king-sized god because Zeus never became master of fate in Greek thinking. Zeus was just as subject to fate as was any man who walked on earth. I think this is the one thing that Zeus missed. If he could have only gotten on top of fate, he might have evolved just as Yahweh evolved. The mystery religions really competed with Christianity, and Christianity took on their coloration in making a mass appeal. The original Sabbath was Saturday. That's when Jesus worshiped. But Sunday, the day of the sun, was the holy day of Mithraism. And when they switched the worship from Saturday to Sunday, it felt better. You know what I mean? Everybody was happy about this. They took on much of the ritual. If you want to get a good book on this subject, get The Mystery Religions and Christianity by an Australian Presbyterian minister by the name of Angus, A-N-G-U-S. The Mystery Religions and Christianity. We think these mystery religions are pretty bad because, remember, the Christians wrote the story of the mystery religions. We don't read about the Mithri martyrs that were slaughtered by the Christians, but they've been dug up where they were slaughtered kneeling at their pews. There was infighting on both sides.
What's the name of that author?
Angus, A-N-G-U-S. The Mystery Religions and Christianity. Christianity first articulated its organization into the patriarchs. There was the Patriarch of Alexandria. There was the Patriarch in Jerusalem. There was the Patriarch in Antioch. There was the Patriarch in Constantinople. There was the Patriarch in Rome.
Now, those were early divisions of the Christian church.
Yes. The concept of bishop is a successor of the apostles. And this bishop has received his powers by consecration from those who once were consecrated by some one of the 12 who were consecrated by Jesus. Right. Early in the evolution of Christendom, the bishops of the larger cities had more authority. Originally, there was no patriarch at Constantinople, because originally there was no Constantinople until Constantine founded it. And then its bishop became a patriarch. And in a church meeting, an ecumenical council where they set up precedents, the Bishop of Constantinople received second precedence in Christendom, ranking with and after the Bishop of Rome. These bishops, the structure of the Christian church took form when the Roman state adopted it. And it patterned itself after the pattern of Roman political organization in the later empire. Rome was divided into provinces, each of which had a provincial capital. The church divided itself into dioceses along these lines. The capital of each province was a larger metropolis than the other cities, and the bishop residing in the provincial metropolis was known as a metropolitan. And the title metropolitan is equivalent to the title of archbishop. It was the original title for archbishop. Later on, as in this metropolitan attempted to exercise authority over the bishops situated in his province or diocese. Originally, the metropolitan stood between the patriarchs and the bishops. Later on, that was broken down. This was the big fight between the papacy and the metropolitans in the West.
About what years?
We're getting, Ruth, into about 400 AD. Constantine would have been about 320. And this is about 400.
Oh, Augustine, about.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Maybe not. Yes. When did the Vandals get down there? Yeah. 400, 500. 476 is the so-called date of the fall of the Western Empire for an anchor date.
476?
476 AD.
I had 412.
No, it's here a little early. In the West, this evolution of the church eventually resulted in the direct responsibility of all bishops to the Bishop of Rome. Another level grew up, a super-metropolitan grew up, a primate. A primate is a bishop who presides when there is a national conclave. A metropolitan or archbishop is a bishop who presides when there is a provincial conclave. Eventually, all of these intermediate groups became authority which was purely auxiliary to the authority at Rome, so that all bishops reported directly to Rome. The Roman Church had a major battle on its hands for control of its own bishops. Every king wanted to control the bishops in his domain, and since these bishops held extensive feudal properties, each king and the emperor in Germany had an argument. If you were the Archbishop of Liege, you held extensive domains in fief from the emperor, and you were a lay lord as well as a spiritual lord. The whole struggle between appointment and investiture is a pretty shameful story of a fight between the emperors and the popes. Question, Ruth?
Yes, the Holy Roman Empire, I've never
Understood this?
understood that,
All
and
right.
this seems as if it might
It
clear it up for me.
All right. The empire went down in the west. It survived in the east until 1453. The empire idea still lived in men's minds. From 476 until 800, there was no emperor in the west. But the Caesars still sat, or the Augusti still sat in Constantinople. In 800 AD, the Pope crowned Charlemagne. He crowned him because he was the strongest guy in the West, and he had temporarily produced some order. He had come down and smacked, his daddy, Pepin the Short, came down and smacked the Lombards who were threatening the papacy, etc., and so on. This was the restoration of the imperial crown in the west of Europe. This crown, Charlemagne's empire was divided. The Franks always divided everything. Well, there was a kingdom of Toulouse at one time, and all manner of things. They split the empire three ways, roughly into the East Franks, the West Franks, and the Middle Franks. In the Middle Franks represented an impossible strip of territory running, starting in about where Holland is, and Belgium and Luxembourg, and Alsace-Lorraine and Switzerland, and the north of Italy, down to Rome. And this was the dominion of Lothar, hence the name Lotharingia, which we know today as Lorraine. Ever since, the East Franks and the West Franks have been battling for this middle strip. Much of the history of Europe is the war for the control of the Empire of Lothar. The crown, everybody didn't get crowned. It wasn't automatic. You had to go to Rome to get this crown. And there was a period of lapse when there was no emperor in the West. And then, when the imperial idea was revived, this time it was revived among the East Franks, who are in process of becoming the Germans, as the West Franks are in process of becoming the French. And the crown, the East Germans operated this way. They elected their king. The East Germans had retained a tribal organization which was lost in Gaul. The Duke of the Bavarians was elected by the Bavarians, and eventually the great tribal dukes would elect a king of the Germans. Later on, this king of the Germans was wont to go to Rome, and when he was crowned, then he was emperor. He received his crown from the Pope. And this was a revival of the second revival of the Roman Empire in the West, called the Holy Roman Empire of the German people. It was Roman because the crown had been revived. It was holy because it came from the Pope, and it was the Roman Empire of the German people. You see, people thought empire. People thought emperor. This was a restoration of that which had been lost. It was an attempt to go back and reproduce what the Romans once had. If the king of the Germans was not crowned, he could not call himself emperor. He was king of the Germans. If he was emperor and wanted to assure the succession of his son, he had his son elected by the electors, and the title there used was King of the Romans. King of the Romans is Crown Prince Designate, who has already been elected. With the death of his father, he would become King of the Germans. When crowned with the Pope, he would become Emperor. In the days of Napoleon witnessed the end of the Holy Roman Empire, and I believe the date is 1806. And that's when the last Holy Roman Emperor abdicated that title and created, simply out of thin air, created a title, Emperor of Austria. The last Holy Roman Empire became the first emperor of Austria. Napoleon tried to revive the empire idea. He crowned himself emperor, and he called his son King of the Romans in imitation of this old German custom. No, in Germany, until the Habsburgs, the succession was by election. And election was by the great princes, including some of the archbishops, a couple of them. There were about, I think, 8 or 9 electors. And this is what it means when you read in history, the Elector of Brandenburg. He was one of those who elected the emperor. The Elector of Saxony. In the general settlement of the debris created by Napoleon, these electors adopted the titles kings. So that as we see them, at the beginning of World War I in 1914, we have a king of Saxony, a king of Bavaria, and so forth.
Luther took advantage, or saved, wasn't he, by some of this squabble.
Sure.
Among the princes.
The Germans were very
hostile.
hostile. The Germans were very hostile to the Italians because the Italians controlled the church. All kings, all political sovereigns were jealous of the Pope because they had taxes being raised in their own country that went to Rome.
Yeah.
And the thing that enabled Luther to win was each one of these princes, dukes, electors, in Bohemia they became kings, he had a chance to get a hold of the church in his territory. Lutheranism, I think, represents a retrogression in the evolution of religion. While the Roman Church claims sovereignty over nations, the Lutheran Church accepts political sovereignty over the church. If one of them has to win, I'd rather the church would win than the state.
Why, Bill? You wouldn't want that now.
You can have Hitler under Lutheranism much easier than you could under Roman Catholicism. The church acts as a check on Franco. But the fundamental dogma of the Lutheran Church is you support the civil authority, whatever it is. The church could criticize Franco, but the Lutheran Church, as the church, could not criticize any government it found itself under. Let's go back to when the Bishop of Rome wasn't so big. The thing I think that, well, let's go back to the turning point. I always like to examine these junctures in history. Where do we miss the boat? Maybe we can learn. At one time, the whole idea of the election of the Pope got out of hand. The Pope was originally elected by the Roman people. At the time of imperial supremacy, when the empire got going before the papacy did, the emperor virtually appointed the Pope. Later on, a group of ecclesiastical authorities were constituted the electors of the Pope. And since these were the first men of the church, they received the title cardinal, which means first. And it carries the civil rank of prince. A cardinal is a prince of the Roman Catholic Church. As the Pope is the emperor of emperors, he wears 3 crowns. The king wears one. The emperor wore a double crown, so the Pope adopted a triple crown. The cardinals, some cardinals broke off at one point. There were 2 popes. There was a pope in France and there was a pope in Rome. For a time, and everybody was excommunicating everybody. No matter which side you were on, the other side was going to excommunicate you. One time there were 3 popes. What?
What century? Straighten me out.
We're along about in 1200 now.
Oh, I haven't been 8.
There was a time when there were 6 popes at the same time. 2 abdicated, I think. I was reading about that.
They finally this thing got so bad that they called an ecumenical council of the church. Up until this time, the one authority that could override a pope was the bishops in session. And this means also the abbots, the archbishops, the primates, and everything. When all of the church authority assembled, it constituted the supreme legislative body of Christendom. And they cleaned things up. As I recall, this may have been the Council of Trent. They fired all the popes and they elected one. Now here is where I believe we could have made the grade without Protestantism, because I regard Protestantism as a major disaster. It really is. Even the name is all wrong. It's a negative name. And consider what's happened to Protestantism. Did they stop splintering? No. We're still splintering. This world needs a new church, just about like it needs a hole in the head. If they could have maintained legislative supremacy in Christendom, I think the Christian church could have evolved and could have avoided the rigidity which it later developed. But they didn't. When this council dissolved itself, the Pope went right back to his old-fashioned ways, and since the cardinals never loused things up again and we never got more than one Pope, the legislature was never again in position to challenge the executive authority in the Roman Catholic Church. And pretty soon the Turks were pounding at the gates of Vienna, and the Pope could act as the rallier of Christendom, which he did rather ineffectually. And it's been that way ever since. In the meantime, we're stuck with how many different creeds and sects in Christendom? The early popes carried a good deal of weight. Everything had collapsed in the West except papal authority, and many of these popes came from patrician Roman families. I mean, they were very able-bodied guys, like Ambrose in Milan. Ambrose was quite a big shot in the civil government, and they elected him Archbishop of Milan over his protest. And I think, let's see, he was ordained a deacon on Monday and something else on every day until he could make Archbishop the next Sunday. He had to go through the hierarchy, but he did it in 1 week. The church attracted the best men in these days. Everything was crumbling. Everything was going to pieces. In these earliest days, the best justice was available in the court of a bishop, not in a corrupt Roman civil court. We're way back now to the Romans, about 400, 500 AD. Some of the very finest brains in Europe were attracted to the early church, and they built it. It was the most vital thing that carried on after the collapse of ancient civilization, and it carried the seeds of civilization with it. We ought to go back and touch on the Greek Orthodox Church. Oh, there were lots of heresies. There was Arianism. They believed that Jesus was lower than the Father. There was Gnosticism. There was Nestorianism. There was the Coptic division. There was Monophysitism, and all manner of things. The biggest split was between the two powerful patriarchs. We can forget Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, because after the Mohammedan tide had passed over that area, there were only two potent patriarchs left. These other guys were submerged. The offices are still there, I think, but I don't think they've ever meant much since. The big battle was between Constantinople and Rome, and the Bishop of Constantinople would not admit the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, whose full title is what? Yes. His correct title is Metropolitan of Rome, Primate of Italy, Patriarch of the West. Those are the original titles of the Bishop of Rome, who styles himself the Pope. Pope means father. In the Greek Orthodox Church, I think the parish priests are called popes, just to get even. At this time, the Patriarch in Constantinople styled himself the ecumenical patriarch, or the universal patriarch. The two churches gradually drifted apart as Western civilization drifted away from Byzantium. In the East, the church has always remained a department of the state. It was an instrument of imperialism in the Byzantine government. It made it impossible for this church to spread in the Balkans without getting involved with the Greeks. That's why the Bulgarians insisted on having their own patriarch. They could not admit the primacy of the patriarch in Constantinople, or they would come under the political thumb of the Byzantine government. This is the church which brought religion to Russia, and at one time there was a patriarch in Moscow. He made too much trouble for, I think it was Peter, who got him out of the way, and now they have only a metropolitan in Moscow, and the supreme authority is accomplished by a synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. This church is, I think, a pretty good hunting ground for us, because its teachings are somewhat on the rigid side. At the same time, it's not as rigid as the Roman Catholic Church. I think we can get blue books into the hands of Greek Orthodox people, or, well, they aren't all Greeks, Russian Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, Bulgarian Orthodox. I believe we have a market here.
Don't they teach the atonement just as rigidly?
Yes. They teach about everything that the Romans do, except their ecclesiastical authority isn't quite as tight as the Roman authority. Their organization isn't quite as tight. And there is one difference in the theology. In the Roman Church, they teach that the Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son. The Greeks teach an independent processional of the Spirit. I really want to talk to you. I want to talk to you about the 13 apostles of Jesus.
John, right?
No, we'll talk about John too. That'll make 14. But there's one in there that that means a great deal to me. That was David Zebedee. Because I understand David Zebedee. You'll recall that Jesus had an experience of working with the three Zebedee brothers, James and John and David. And the James and John were very interested in his teachings, his religious theorizing, when he worked in Zebedee's boat shop in Capernaum. David wasn't too interested in Jesus' teachings, although he thought he was a real guy as a mechanic. He was a good boat builder. And you'll recall that James and John really should have been the first chosen apostles. Now, the first disappointment that any of the 12 had in their dealings with Jesus came to these among his oldest friends, because they were out looking for him when he was meditating his problems that lay ahead, the 40 days out in the wilderness. They were out there searching for him when Andrew came to Jesus and asked to be chosen as an apostle. Andrew is the only one who took the initiative, and Jesus accepted him. And then you'll recall that Andrew was the first missionary, because he went and got his brother Peter and brought him to Jesus and asked that he be accepted. And this was the beginning of this group of 12. When James and John came down from the hills, they were quite disappointed to discover that the first and second seats at the table had been already preempted by these former apostles, by these former disciples of John the Baptist. And Jesus told them, he said, no, look. He said, no, you know full well you're first in my heart, but you also could have been first in the eyes of men if you had not been away on a self-imposed task, which nobody asked you to do, namely, looking for a person who wasn't lost up in the hills. And they were good sports about it, and they accepted his offer. And these were the first 4. In many respects, these 4 men were the most effective of the 12. Later on, when Jesus organized the 12, he did so by appointing Andrew as chief. That's interesting, that they called Jesus master and they called Andrew chief. And when he asked Andrew to set up the apostolic organization, he requested that he detail some of the 12 to be his companions, simply to be with him. And Andrew picked Peter and James and John. Andrew was an introvert more than an extrovert. He was in many ways the antithesis of Peter. He suffered greatly from a reticence to compliment. And this fear of complimentation was due to his abhorrence of flattery. And it hurt Andrew, I think, in his effectiveness in dealing with groups of people. Andrew was a poor preacher, but an excellent personal worker. His greatest talent was his ability to discover, to see, to discern what a person could do, and to get that person on the right job and convinced that he could do it. Andrew was a good picker of men. He was a good chief. He was a good organizer. I think of Andrew as being something like a veranda deck. Not real versatile like a Melchizedek, but stable like the Rock of Gibraltar. Andrew didn't make very many mistakes. Andrew was seldom at a loss when it came to making an administrative decision. And if you'll stop and consider, most of the administrative decisions in the apostolic corps were made by Andrew. A good example is when the Greeks showed up. Philip didn't know what to do. Here were a bunch of unorthodox people asking to see Jesus. So he took the problem to Andrew, and Andrew handled the problem. Peter, I think, is one of the most fascinating characters among the 12. I met a duplicate of Simon Peter down in Oklahoma City. His name is Alexander. He's pastor of the First Christian Church. He's quite a guy. I went to his services last Easter. Bill Alexander wears a waistcoat, and he wears it well. He's a great big football player type with red hair. His sermon has got every trick of showmanship in the world in it, and it's a darn good sermon besides. I can see the showmanship, but I also appreciated the sermon. It was a good sermon. If we can ever interest Bill Alexander, we've got Peter. We haven't got a Peter in the group so far. We don't have a real orator, a real preacher. This guy might preach, and we might get 2,000 souls interested in the Blue Book, just like Pentecost. And maybe he won't be interested, but I think he is. Peter was aggressive, creative, and impulsive. I've tested men just like Simon Peter. I could draw you Peter's temperament chart. In the aggressive area, Peter would be very high. In the self-control area, very low. And like most darn good salesmen, Peter had a quality we call low social independence. Peter wanted to go along with the group. Peter hated to say no. Peter was very vulnerable to ridicule. This is typical of a really fine, typical sales type. This vulnerability to ridicule, I think, made it very necessary for Jesus to see to it that Peter went through something which was going to act as a permanent bit of education. I think this whole episode in Caiaphas' courtyard was Jesus' technique of administering cowpox to Peter because he saw he was vulnerable to smallpox. And all of the agony of cowpox was much better than the lethal effects of smallpox. Like most creative people of this type, Peter moved fast. When Jesus wanted to wash his feet at the Last Supper, Peter said no, he wouldn't let Jesus humiliate himself. When Jesus explained why he wanted to wash Peter's feet, Peter then asked to be washed all over. When they were nearing after the crucifixion, when they were up in the Sea of Galilee, and they realized it was Jesus standing on the shore. There were 10 of them in the boat. 9 rowed, but Peter jumped overboard and swam. Peter is the sort of a person I think could get me real mad, and I like him real well. Peter wasn't interested in theology at all. Peter was just interested in the immediate and practical application of this to people. That's Bill Alexander's reaction. Bill Alexander could care less about most of this book, but will it help people? That's all he wants to know. Father, Son, Spirit, Paradise, Deity, Universal, and Unqualified Absolute. The first source and center is original reality. The next 3 are actual reality. The last 3 are potential reality. God